Hey everyone, my name is Tulsee and I lead product for Google's responsible AI and ML fairness efforts. And so this means that I work with a number of our product teams across Google, as well as our awesome research teams and our policy teams to build more diverse, inclusive, and ethical products, really trying to understand how we can take our machine learning based products and make sure they work well for everyone. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and nuances and tips and tricks for building inclusive AI products. So I want to start with this visual of the latest line of Barbie dolls that released earlier this year in February, because I think it really highlights the value and the importance of inclusive products. Here you have Barbies that represent what in their own terms is a multidimensional view of fashion and beauty. You have Barbie dolls who dress differently, who express themselves differently, who have different ethnicities and abilities. And this whole process of developing this way goes to show how important it can be to build products that really teach us what it means to be beautiful, that what it means to value ourselves and our own identities. I think building inclusive products really at the end of the day is about making sure that every single user feels heard and feels seen. And I think this is one product that I felt like is a great example of doing that. Another example is from a tweet I found last year. And here is an example of a man showing a Band-Aid that for the first time in his life actually matches his skin tone. You know, whether it be Barbie dolls or Band-Aids, building products that actually make people feel like they're heard and they're valued in the experience, providing experiences that really work is an incredible feeling and is, I think, truly a magical part of the product development process. But how do you do this with AI, right? I think it can often feel hard to really conceptualize what inclusive AI really means when it feels often like you're talking about an opaque system that's built with a lot of numbers. So what does it really mean to build an inclusive AI product? Well, I think the argument I would make is that it's the same thing. It's about building an AI product that when a user engages with it and partners with this product, that they feel like the product is working for them, that the product is thoughtful, that it doesn't harm or stereotype users, that it really provides each and every user with an experience that is valuable and that meets their goals and intents. So what does that actually mean and how do we actually do that? Well, let's start with just a brief recap of what a typical AI development process and pipeline actually looks like. So here you have kind of a pretty standard visual of what an AI development process looks like. And of course, things change for different models, but in general, you have collection of data, right? And this is kind of that first backbone of what are you actually going to train your model with? What data are you putting in the system? You label that data for some sort of ground truth, right? So if you were building an image classification model, you would have a whole bunch of images and you might label them with what's actually in the image. You then train your model using some sort of objective. You might be aiming for accuracy or you might be aiming for precision or recall. You then provide that in some sort of experience to the user. You filter or aggregate or show the user in some way. You build up an experience. Users actually see that effect. And then users engage with that product. And of course, their behavior and how they engage with the product then affects the way that we collect and build up the product from there. And it continues to grow in this iterative loop. And I think what's really critical to think about here is what does it mean then for this loop to be potentially non-inclusive or unfair? And what's really, I think, important is that unfairness can enter into the system at any point in this ML pipeline. You can have bias in the way that you collect the data. Where did you get the data from? What does it represent? You can have bias in the way that the data is labeled in terms of who's labeling the data and what do they interpret. In the way that you choose the objectives and how you define success. In the way that you actually filter or aggregate or rank the data. In what the users actually see and what they engage with. And then of course the users themselves have unconscious or conscious biases in the way that they want to engage with the experience and the way that they interact with the product. And so I think it's really important as we think about what it means to build from fairness and with inclusion or diversity in mind, to really think about the full end-to-end life cycle of a product and making sure at every stage of the way that we're asking questions about who could this work for? Who else could this work for? Who might this not be working for? Who is it meant to work for? What I'm going to try and do in this talk is walk through 4 kind of high-level lessons, I guess, or high-level thoughts around how to build inclusive AI. And for each one of these, I'll provide some case studies or product examples, sharing some of what I've learned in this process and experience, and then looking forward, to following up with all of you with more questions and conversation and discussion. I think this is a space that we're all still learning about and still growing in together. So I'm looking forward to learning more from all of you and from others in the industry who are thinking about this. The first one I want to sort of focus on is being thoughtful about the goals and the objectives. I touched upon this a little bit when we were talking about the ML pipeline and the ML process, but I think it's actually really, really critical. And let's talk about an example actually that just happened about a month ago, which is the UK A-level algorithm. So for those who aren't familiar, in the UK, there's a certain set of tests that you take whose scores really impact your ability to get into certain universities. So these are extremely important because the higher your scores, the more likely you are to be able to get into top-tier universities, and of course it affects the trickle down from there. This year, because of the COVID pandemic, A-levels weren't actually happening, and so as a result of that, the board actually decided to use an algorithm to determine the test scores instead of the test. And this algorithm looked at a bunch of different factors, including the school you went to and the past performance of that school, your class's past performance on GCSE exams, which are the exams that are taken before the A-level exams, and a number of factors that could then hopefully predict what you were likely to score on your A-levels. In theory, you can imagine a world in which I guess you could predict a test score, although of course I think there's a number of questions there in and of itself. But not surprisingly, what they found when they actually looked at the results is that private schools saw the largest rise in top grades, right, in really high A-level grades, whereas other schools in the public school system and schools especially in poorer or lower economic status areas had much lower scores overall and definitely a lower increase in top scores. What does this mean? Well, it means that their bias in the algorithm actually directly translates to the student's potential to get into certain universities. This is a case where the algorithm itself makes a life-critical decision for users. And it's important for us to think about what are the effects of that and who might it affect and who might it affect differently. There's been a lot of criticism towards the algorithm about biased data and bad data, leveraging certain information and not others. Or the fact that the algorithm was too simple and it didn't have enough nuance to really capture all of the aspects. But the thing I would actually challenge here is, was this the right problem to be solving with machine learning in the first place? And what was the actual goal of the product, right? As a product manager, I think we often think about what is the actual goal? What are we trying to achieve for users? I think in this case, the ideal goal would have been, hey, we want to figure out, given that A-levels are not happening, a better way to match colleges with students and a better way to help colleges identify students with high potential. The problem instead that they solved was, how do we most accurately proxy A-level test scores? And I think this is a really big difference because those two goals solve for different types of users. They solve for different types of use cases, and the types of harms that they could promote are very different. And I think it's really critical when we as product managers are thinking about how we're building machine learning to first ask the question of, is machine learning even the right solution? And when we introduce machine learning, what value is it going to add? But also, what harm is it going to bring? And to whom, right? And I think that's the really critical question as well. Because in this case, for students who were going to elite schools and were in the private school system, it's very possible that this algorithm was actually working just fine for them. It was providing a reasonable approximation of good test scores. For some students, it actually might inflate their test scores. But for students in other districts, maybe who had been working really hard to study for these A-level exams and who were really qualified, they were actually being underinflated, if that's a word, for these results. So who is it serving effectively? Who is it leaving behind? And who are you actually trying to serve? I think the one thing that is really important here is also thinking then about the diversity of users who your product tends to serve. And this is where it comes to going beyond the average, right? One of the things that I touched upon in this previous example was the fact that students in different areas, students in different income classes, might have different perceptions about this algorithm and what it provided, and it might actually add different value to them. We need to make sure that as we think about how we're building our products, that we don't think about users as one mass and one average sort of set of users, but actually think about the differences in how a user might use a product and where a user may live, the resources that a user may have access to, the intents that a user might have, the needs that a user might have from a product. And as those differ, of course, then the outcomes and what you might actually want to design for those users will differ as well. In general, I think an average metric is often what we learn in school, right? You want to take billions of data points and average them out to a single number. Simplify a very, very complex problem by finding ways to showcase an overall, picture of the situation. And I think in general, this is valuable, right? It is valuable to simplify billions of data points into simple numbers. For example, an IMDb rating or a Rotten Tomatoes percentage. But the thing is that the average inherently smooths over the differences and the variations. In this example with Gone with the Wind, you see an 8.1 out of 10 IMDb score, which is very high. What it doesn't tell you is that there is a pocket of users, many of whom have really significant concerns about the portrayal of slavery in the movie, and that there's been a lot of discussion about how we provide better context with this film about depictions that may actually be quite racist or perpetuating offensive stereotypes and harms. The average is meant to reflect the majority, right? It's meant to be sort of a baseline or a general framing. But when you miss some of these really, really crucial variances, you miss societal context that is extremely important to have. You miss user perceptions that might be really valuable. And you miss what could be really harmful or offensive to a particular set of users or to users more broadly. When we think about going beyond the average, I think there's a few things we can do to actually make that happen. One is making sure that we actually develop metrics and test for every set of user groups and communities, right? So really making sure that we develop metrics, not just for overall, how is our product working, but really looking at slices to understand how the experience is different for different types of users. We could also see the different user experiences that actually make up the data, right? So really trying to actually dig into the data, be a part of that experience. And I think as a PM, that's actually one of the biggest things that I think we add to in the machine learning development process, is really understanding the users that underlie the data. And then lastly, really understanding the harms and the societal context for a different set of users. When we talk about developing metrics, I think there's so many examples where if we had more diverse metrics, we could capture more diverse experiences. I think most of us probably have worked in product environments, or if you have not yet worked in a product environment, you definitely will, where you'll experience how quantitative situations are. We set a metric, and then we aim to move that metric, and we value our success and our impact based on how that metric moves. Here's an example from the Jigsaw Toxicity Classifier. It's a classifier that we've built at Google, aimed to classify toxic comments. So comments that are hateful versus comments that are really positive. A comment that gets a score of 0 is considered very positive, very neutral, and then it goes to a scale of 1, where 1 is really toxic, right? So I absolutely hate puppies would be on like the higher end of the spectrum. And we obviously were measuring overall metrics for the classifier. And then in 2017, the team released the classifier externally to get feedback from users in terms of whether they were classifying things appropriately with a web UI. And a user typed in these 2 sentences: I am straight and I am gay. I am straight got an extremely low score, non-toxic, whereas I am gay got an extremely high score. And this was a wake-up call for the team. This was a case where us not testing for different terms or recognizing how different terms might have encoded different biases, or the model may be working differently, led us to make mistakes and errors that are extremely harmful, that say something about Google's values, but also are harms that we just don't want to perpetuate. Since then, the toxicity classifier team, the Jigsaw Perspective API, has actually built in metrics into their system to evaluate across slices. And their ability to do that has allowed them to actually, again, track and move improvements. Originally, in the toxicity V1, you see a lot of purple, which represents slices where the error rates are higher. And those are slices where, again, shows how different slices can be and how important it is to measure across each slice. And as we started measuring it, once the classifier got better, we were able to actually look at 6 versions later, results that look a lot better. The classifier is not perfect, and the team is continuously iterating not just on the classifier, but actually on the metrics to make sure it has a diverse set of metrics that capture different types of user experiences. But I think this example really does highlight the importance of being able to evaluate and the importance of being able to evaluate at scale. I will also say, as I noted earlier, that it's not just about evaluating sort of these slices, but actually really understanding how different users are experiencing the product. Behind billions of data points are real people with real, valued, lived experiences. You want to make sure that you actually understand the people who live behind this data. What are the different trends or patterns that exist between these different users? For example, what types of sentences are different communities using? What type of words are they using? What type of harms might impact certain communities more than others? How do the reviews of Gone with the Wind change for different users? And what might that tell us about the product experience we're building? And how do we make sure we account for those in those metrics that we're designing? I think it's also worth noting not just who is represented in your data, but who is actually left out of your data. It's really critical to think about who is the user that your product is trying to reach. For example, many of our products at Google are global products. They're really meant to reach every single user in every corner of the world. In which case, we would also want our data to represent that broad user base. And we also want to understand where it's not. An example you see here is from a model that was trained on the Open Images dataset. And the Open Images dataset is a pretty broad public dataset that has a number of images, and it's used often as a benchmark for image classification tasks. So you can take an image and it's labeled in Open Images with a bunch of labels of what is in the image. So ceremony, wedding, bride, etc. When a model was trained based on the Open Images dataset, here's what we saw in some of the images that we looked at. The first 3 images are images of what looks like mostly traditional Western weddings. And you see that the model accurately labels these images as ceremony, wedding, bride, dress, etc. But for the last image, which is not a Western wedding, but is still a wedding, the model labels the image as person, people. Why does the model miss this? Well, in the Open Images dataset, when we actually did further investigation, you see that most of the images are Western-centric. We've, in the past couple years, actually released extensions to this dataset to try and increase the geographic reach of the images. But if someone is using that original Open Images dataset, while they may look at the variations of the users and have a bunch of metrics, your data is leaving out some of the users that you're hoping to represent. And with that, you're leaving out their culture. You're leaving out that global part of the experience. And the harms, if that experience goes wrong, could be very different, but all very meaningful. You can exclude users. You can erase aspects of culture and community. You can cause offense, stereotype, lead certain users to have more disadvantageous outcomes than others, or advantageous outcomes than others. And so I think it's important to think about the data from all of those aspects. How do we look at what data we have? How do we identify what data we don't have? How do we think about where we get the data and what that might mean, and what constructs that data is based in? Towards the end of the talk, I will have a link to some tools that we've built at Google that might be able to help you if you're interested in evaluating data sets that you're already using. The last thing I'll say around thinking about the averages and going beyond the averages is make sure that you think about the possible harms and build guardrails into the product wherever possible. We talked about some of the harms before. Some of those you might want to think about data collection, some of those you may want to think about other things, modeling improvements. But it's also worth thinking about what are things that you never want to see happen in your product? What are policy changes you may want to make? This example on the left is from Gmail Smart Reply, where we actually have made a policy choice not to show replies that have gendered pronouns. For example, if an email said, hey, did the engineer complete that task? Well, you wouldn't want to respond, yes, he did. But you don't know if the engineer is male or female, or if the engineer goes by a non-gender binary pronoun. And rather than making that assumption and perpetuating stereotypes, we decided that that was actually a policy we wanted to take, to say there are other smart replies we can provide. Yes, the engineer did, for example. The next thing I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is the importance of understanding the system in which you're building. I talked a little bit about this earlier when we talked about the A-level exams, but I think it's actually really critical to understand societal context, not just providing guardrails, but actually understanding where and how you can do those things. How do you know even who to slice for example? When coronavirus hit the United States earlier this year, we saw huge discrepancies in the way that it treated different communities, counties, neighborhoods, demographics, and especially saw the systemic racism that it was bringing to light by affecting Latino and Black communities significantly more than other communities. Therefore, when we decided to build a COVID forecasting model at Google, it was extremely important to understand this systemic inequality and the effect that COVID was having. It's important, therefore, not just to actually make sure that the COVID forecasting model is working overall, which, by the way, a COVID forecasting model would be us trying to predict the number of cases in a particular county over the next 7 days, for example. So important to not only understand how that model is working overall, but actually understand its impact on different communities of color, right? So understanding its impact across counties that have different populations or different percentages of the Black population, of the Hispanic population, of the white population. Here you see, for example, that absolute errors differ between counties that have higher percentages of Black community versus lower percentages. Understanding this and being transparent about this to those who are going to use the COVID forecasting model in different communities and evaluating different metrics that help us understand where the model is working and where it's not working allow us to actually first understand the trade-offs in developing a model like this, the potential values and benefits to certain communities, how we make sure that the model works for every community, and to give individuals who are going to be using this model in counties across the country the right set of information so that they can work well for every single one of their users. Because at the end of the day, if the model doesn't work for every single one of your users, then you are going to create inequities in the way that we're developing product and persist the systemic racism, the systemic sexism, many of these other issues that we've seen in our industry, but in the world at large and in the web at large. And I think it's really important that we think about the systemic and societal contexts, the ways in which the world has grown to develop these issues, and then build to not only account for them, but hopefully long-term mitigate them and be a force for change and a force for good. As a part of being a force for change and a force for good, another thing we can do is think about how we give users a voice in the product. Because at the end of the day, building an inclusive AI system, or really any AI system, is about trust, right? If you have the trust of your users and you've earned the trust of your users, then your users will actually have a valuable end-to-end experience. And when users don't have an end-to-end experience, that's one of the first things that breaks trust. When you think about trust, it's about making sure that the full experience works well. But we know that different users are different. And we just talked about how different systems and societal contexts, different data points, right, different goals and objectives may meet the criteria of different users differently. And so because different users will come into your product with different intents, you want to think about how you allow these users to provide their own context, the context that they're coming in with, the needs that they're coming in with. For example, let's say you're translating from English to Spanish. Well, English doesn't have gendered nouns the way that Spanish does. And so if someone was trying to translate the word friend, they could translate that to amigo or amiga. What we want to make sure is that we don't perpetuate stereotypes by assuming that a user wants a particular outcome, and instead actually provide the user with the context and the ability to actually give us that information. Are they looking for the masculine version of the term or the feminine version of the term? And based on that, the user can actually continue that experience holistically. Not only do we want them to be able to provide that type of context in the experience itself, but also allow them to give us the feedback. Tell us when the experience isn't working for them. Here, in this example, you can see the user's ability to potentially hide a story, say that they're not interested in a particular topic, or maybe not even interested in the particular publisher. They can also customize what they see and send feedback. Each of these elements allows an experience to potentially get better and grow over time, work better actually for more users, including this user, but give the user a sense of control, especially when experiences can be random or feel inconsistent. It allows users to feel like they have the ability to participate in the product, that they can be seen and they can be heard, whether the product is working well or when it makes a mistake. Overall, I'm hoping what all of this and all of these examples showed is that as a PM, we make many decisions every day, large ones around objectives and goals and how we're going to collect data, and smaller decisions about how we're going to evaluate a particular example or what type of metric we're going to use to showcase an average or something else. Each one of these decisions have drastic impacts on the experience for different and diverse users. What you see here on the screen is an onboarding flow from when a new user opens YouTube. And there's so many decisions that went into the creation of this flow, including how do we select the right topics, how do we rank them, what topics should we filter out because we shouldn't be suggesting these to users. And each one of those decisions might impact the experience of whether a user finds a topic that is valuable, finds it early on in the flow, or just leaves the flow behind and goes straight to the YouTube experience. And so the thing is take each of those decisions seriously. Take them seriously from your perspective as a PM, but also from the perspective of the various types of users that you want to serve with your product. And also know that you don't have to do it alone. These approaches are complex. These products are complex. Understanding different users and their various needs is not something that we're all going to know because we all don't have that lived experience. So bringing in public policy, social science, design, engineering can really help to make sure that we're accounting for different perspectives and that we're building this up together. And especially when you're talking about ML fairness and inclusion in AI, these challenges need to take into account things like how do people feel about fairness when they're interacting with the system? How can we make the systems more transparent? What is the societal impact of these systems? And those are questions that can be better served with a wide variety of perspectives and incentives coming into the conversation. And also make sure that you're asking diverse users. Conduct user research with users from different geographies, different locations, different backgrounds, and bring in and lift up diverse voices within your organization to provide perspectives. The reality is different users will always come to a product differently. They'll have different perspectives, they'll ask different questions, they'll think about different cases of failure that they've experienced or that they could experience. And so if you bring in these voices, you're more likely to find the cases where your product may not work, but also, maybe even more excitingly, find the opportunities where it could truly actually create a meaningfully different experience for a set of users. Overall, what I'm hoping we've talked a little bit about today and has come across through some of these examples is that building inclusive AI is really about building excellent AI, right? Building really high quality models where we've thought about the goals and the objectives, where we've thought about the variance in the users, who the data represents and who it doesn't, where we've understood the systemic context that this product is being built in, and where we give users a voice every step of the way. As I mentioned earlier, there's some great resources that we've built at Google that I think are really helpful, at least in my journey, and hopefully helpful in yours as well. One is the PAIR guidebook, which you can find at this link here. It actually is, in general, a really great resource if you're building an ML product. It walks through a lot of some of the things I talked about, but more broadly around design and design principles when building AI. And then on the right, you have the TensorFlow Responsible AI Toolkit, which, if you're building a TensorFlow model, has a number of really great resources that can help you evaluate your data sets, slice your model for different user groups, build transparency tools and documentation resources, and many other things. So please do check that out. I'll end with one final note to share Google's AI principles. One of the things we built a couple years ago are these 7 principles that we are trying to build into our AI products. I spent most of the time today talking about the second one. How do we avoid creating or reinforcing unfair biases? And therefore, how do we create more inclusive products? But I do think it's worth, if you're building an AI product, to think about this broader set of principles. How do you make sure that your product is built and tested for safety, that it's accountable, that it values privacy, that it upholds scientific excellence? And related to principles number 1 and 7, how did you think about the use cases? Are the use cases socially beneficial? Are the use cases going to uphold these other principles? I found the principles to be a really good guiding light as we start developing products. And I think they shine a much broader light on how far we have to go. I think we're still in such early days of learning about how to build products successfully that are inclusive and thoughtful and ethical, and continuously learning what it means to be inclusive in different contexts of different products. And I think this is something that hopefully will continue to grow and learn together as an industry. But if we can share these light posts, then we can work towards them together. And I'm excited to see what we can do to build products that are honestly more equitable. With that, thank you so much for taking the time to listen and participate today, and looking forward to chatting more with all of you.